My mother-in-law smiled when she handed me the deed to a cellar house. That was her first mistake.
I was 55 years old, 29 years married, walking out with $41,000 and the deed to a condemned house nobody had entered in years. Shirley Mercer called it generous. Her son didn't say a word. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to find out, was that Ida Mae Mercer had spent the last 40 years of her life putting something behind a locked door in that house. Something she had made with her own hands. Something she had saved for exactly this moment, for the person they would throw away. That person turned out to be me. The lawyer's office had 3 chairs on one side of the table and one on the other. Carol Jean had known, before she walked in, which side would be hers. Dave Coulter's office was on the 2nd floor of a building downtown that also housed a title company and a tax preparer. The carpet was the color of old mustard. A water stain spread across the ceiling tile above the conference table like a map of somewhere nobody wanted to go. Carol Jean had noticed these things because she was a nurse, and nurses noticed what other people walked past. She sat closest to the door. Shirley Mercer sat at the head of the table without being asked. She set her handbag on the chair beside her, the chair that might otherwise have been Carol Jean's, and folded her hands. She wore a navy cardigan with pearl buttons, and her hair was done the way it was always done, not a strand out of place. 77 years old, and she still arrived everywhere looking like she was chairing a board meeting. Wayne sat to Shirley's left, scrolling his phone with one thumb. He hadn't looked up when Carol Jean walked in. Douglas sat between them. He was looking at the table. Carol Jean had worn the gray sweater she bought at Kohl's the week before because she didn't know what a person wore to the end of 29 years, and she hadn't wanted to get it wrong. Her purse was on the floor beside her feet, $41 in her wallet, a granola bar, her phone at 9%. Dave Coulter opened a manila folder and put on his reading glasses. He was a thin man who cleared his throat before every sentence, as if each one required permission. "We're here to finalize the dissolution of the marriage between Carol Jean Mercer and Douglas Allen Mercer," he said. "All parties have reviewed the settlement agreement. We'll go through the assets in order." Shirley uncrossed and recrossed her legs. "Please keep it moving, Dave." He nodded and began. The house on Mockingbird Lane, 4 bedrooms, Douglas's name on the mortgage since the 2019 refinance, to Douglas. The joint retirement account, after administrative fees Shirley had arranged through a financial advisor Carol Jean had never met, split 60-40. Carol Jean's 40 came to $41,000. The Tahoe to Douglas. The Camry, 2014, needed new tires, a dent in the rear bumper that Carol Jean had put there in 2018 backing into the mailbox. To Carol Jean. She listened. She kept her hands folded in her lap, the way she'd learned to keep them in rooms like this one, in rooms where the Mercer family made decisions and expected silence in return. Coulter turned a page. "One remaining asset," he said. "Real property, 447 Ridge Hollow Road, Sevier County. Single structure on approximately 3 acres. County assessment." He paused, just slightly. $7. Wayne looked up from his phone for the first time. Shirley opened her handbag. She removed a key, old, brass, tied with a short length of twine, and set it on the table. Not slid. Set. Gently. The way you set down something fragile, or something you want to appear fragile. She looked at Carol Jean with the expression she used at Thanksgiving when she complimented Carol Jean's pie crust. Patient, warm, entirely in control. "The property belonged to Douglas's grandmother," Shirley said. "Ida Mae. It's been in the family a long time. The structure needs work, of course, but we felt it was important that Carol Jean receive something meaningful, something with history. She paused. Ida May would have wanted her to have it. Carol Jean looked at the key on the table. It was small. The twine was knotted twice, the kind of knot you tie when you don't trust the first one. In her coat pocket, her fingers found the silver thimble. It was cold, the way it was always cold, even after hours in her pocket. She had carried it since March of last year, when Ida May had pressed it into her palm during what turned out to be their last real visit. The thimble was engraved, I.M.H. Ida May Hargrove, the name she'd been born with before she became a Mercer. Don't open it yet, Ida May had said. The envelope she'd given Carol Jean that same afternoon, the one with the small key and the lawyer's name in Gatlinburg. Wait until you need it. Carol Jean had not understood what that meant. She'd put the envelope in a shoebox under the bed and forgotten about it during the months that followed. The months when everything fell apart, in the particular quiet way things fell apart in the Mercer family, without argument, without any single moment she could point to later and say, there. That was it. She reached across the table and picked up the key Shirley had placed there. It was lighter than she'd expected. Thank you, she said. Coulter turned to the signature page. The pen he handed her was cheap, the kind that skips on the first stroke. Carol Jean pressed harder and signed her name. Douglas did not look up. Outside, 2 floors down, a car alarm went off and then stopped. Coulter collected the papers. Shirley gathered her handbag and stood without waiting for anyone else to stand first. Wayne followed. Their footsteps went down the hallway and faded. Coulter came back to the doorway. Is there anything you need, Mrs. Mercer? She almost said, it's Stafford. Carol Jean Stafford, the name she'd had before. Some days she thought about going back to it. No, she said. Thank you, Dave. She sat in the empty conference room for a few more minutes, holding the small brass key, looking at the water stain on the ceiling. Then she put the key in her coat pocket beside the thimble and stood up. The drive to Sevier County was 3 hours. She had made that drive 100 times, never alone. She had driven this stretch of the 441 South 100 times, always with apple bread on the passenger seat and a list of things to tell Ida May. Today the seat was empty. The interstate out of Knoxville took her past the exits she knew. The hospital where she'd worked 12-hour shifts for 19 years. The Kroger where she and Douglas had shopped on Sunday mornings. The overpass where the guardrail had been repaired twice and still listed slightly to the left. She knew this city the way you know a place you've lived in long enough to stop seeing. Today, she saw all of it. She did not turn on the radio. It had been 3 months since she'd listened to music. She wasn't sure when that had happened exactly, only that one morning she'd reached for the dial and then hadn't. Past Sevierville, the land started rising. The highway narrowed. Strip malls gave way to hardware stores and feed suppliers and a barbecue place with a hand-painted sign that had been there since Carol Jean was a girl. The Smokies came up slowly on the right, blue-gray in the February haze, the way they looked in winter when the trees were bare and you could see the actual shape of the ridgeline. She passed the exit for Sevierville and remembered the bakery on Court Avenue where she used to stop. Apple bread, still warm, wrapped in wax paper. Ida May would unwrap it at the table in her room and eat exactly 1 slice before putting the rest away for later, which meant Carol Jean would find the rest of it untouched the following month and throw it out and buy a new loaf on the way up. She had done this for 11 years. Ida May had never once asked her to. The visits had started in the winter of 2009, when Douglas mentioned at dinner that his grandmother had been moved to a care facility in Sevierville and that someone from the family would probably check in on her at some point. Carol Jean had driven up the following Saturday. She wasn't sure afterward what had made her go. Ida May was sharp and small and had looked Carol Jean over the way a woman looks at another woman when she's deciding how much to trust her. Then she'd said, "You can sit down if you want. I don't bite." So Carol Jean had sat down, and then she'd come back. Every month, for 11 years, she had come back. The family visited the way families visit when visits feel like obligation. Shirley came at Christmas with poinsettias and stayed 45 minutes. Wayne stopped by once in 2015 to sign something. Douglas went every few months, sat in the chair beside the bed, and ran out of things to say by the second minute. Carol Jean brought apple bread and listened. Ida May talked about the mountain, about the house on Ridge Hollow Road, where she'd lived for most of her life, about Thomas, who had died in 1983 and whose absence she treated as a recent event even 30 years later. She talked about her hands, which had slowed down, and about the quilts she was no longer able to finish, and about a locked room in the old house that she had never described in detail, except to say that it held things she had made, and that the right person would find them when the time came. Carol Jean had asked once, in 2010, what she meant by the right person. "I mean someone who showed up," Ida May said. And then she changed the subject. In March of last year, 4 months before Ida May died, Carol Jean had arrived to find her quieter than usual. The apple bread sat on the nightstand unopened. Ida May watched Carol Jean settle into the chair and then reached into the drawer beside the bed and took out 2 things. The first was a silver thimble, small and worn at the tip, engraved with the letters IMH along the rim. "Ida May Hargrove," she said. "My name before I was a mercer." She pressed it into Carol Jean's hand and closed her fingers around it. The second was a small envelope, unsealed. Inside, Carol Jean had glimpsed a key, smaller than the brass one Shirley would hand her 11 months later, and a slip of paper with a name and address written in Ida May's careful hand. "Don't open it yet," Ida May said. "Wait until you need it." Carol Jean had driven home that afternoon with the thimble in her coat pocket and the envelope in her purse. That night, she'd put the envelope in a shoebox under the bed, behind the extra blankets, in the careful way she put things she intended to deal with later. Then Douglas had started coming home at irregular hours, and the papers arrived from his attorney, and the shoebox had stayed where it was through 6 months of everything falling apart. And she had not thought about the envelope again until this morning, in the empty conference room, holding a different key. The GPS lost signal at mile marker 7 on the gravel road. Carol Jean pulled over and read the address from the slip Coulter had given her, then kept driving by memory. The trees on either side grew close. A branch dragged across the roof of the Camry. The road dipped and rose and dipped again. Then the trees opened. The house sat against the ridge with the late afternoon light behind it. The porch sagged at one corner. Vines had claimed most of the east wall. The windows were dark with years of dust, but the walls were straight. The roofline was even. 60 years on a Tennessee mountain, and the structure had not moved. The house at the end of the road was smaller than she remembered, but it was standing. After everything, it was still standing. Carol Jean sat in the car for a moment with the engine running. The front door opened on the first try. That was the first thing that surprised her. Carol Jean had expected resistance. Swollen wood, a lock frozen from years of disuse. Instead, the key turned smooth, and the door swung inward on its own weight, slowly, the way doors open in old houses that have settled into themselves over decades. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Cedar. Dry and clean, the way a hope chest smells when you open it after a long time. Not mold, not rot, not the particular sourness of a place that has been closed too long and forgotten. Cedar, as if someone had thought about what this house would smell like years from now and had planned accordingly. She stood in the doorway and waited for her eyes to catch up. The front room came into focus gradually. Wide plank floors, dark oak, covered in a layer of dust that had settled evenly over everything like the first snow of winter. The walls were board and batten, vertical planks fitted tight with no gaps. A stone fireplace on the far wall, its hearth swept clean. Above the mantel, a single iron hook held a length of red yarn, still wound, still waiting. Not a ruin. A room that had been closed, not abandoned. There was a difference, Carol Jean knew. She had seen abandoned places, the kind where water gets in and nature takes back what it can, where the floors go soft and the ceilings cave and everything that was once useful becomes a hazard. This was not that. Someone had closed this house the way you close something you intend to return to, or the way you close something you intend for someone else to find. She moved through the front room without touching anything. The kitchen. 4 wooden chairs around a table, one of them pulled out at an angle, as if Ida May had just stood up from it. Dishes in the cabinet behind glass doors, stacked and dusty but unbroken. A cast iron skillet on the stove, dry and seasoned, the handle turned toward the wall the way her own mother had always kept hers. The small bedroom at the back, a single bed with an iron frame, the mattress covered in a folded quilt. Carol Jean stepped closer. The quilt was small, 18 inches wide, perhaps 24, and hung not on the bed but on the wall above it, fixed to a wooden dowel with 2 cotton ties. She brought the flashlight up. The quilt showed a house on a hillside, a small house wood-framed with a stone chimney and an apple tree to the left. Smoke rose from the chimney in careful stitches of gray and white thread. In the lower right corner, worked in thread so fine she had to lean in to read it. IMH 1947. Ida May Hargrove, 26 years old. Carol Jean stood in front of it for longer than she meant to. Then she continued down the hall. 3 doors. First, a bathroom, small, the fixtures original to the house. Second, a linen closet, folded sheets still on the shelves, smelling of the cedar blocks tucked between them. Third, at the end of the hall, a door that was different from the others. Darker wood, heavier. The hinges were newer, not the original hardware, but something installed later, deliberately. And the lock was not the same lock as the front door. Carol Jean tried the brass key Shirley had placed on the conference table that morning. She fitted into the lock and turned. It didn't move. She tried again, pressing in while she turned, the way you sometimes had to with old locks. Nothing. The key was too wide, the shaft too thick. It had never fit this lock. She stood in the hallway and looked at the keyhole, small, round-barreled. Someone had installed this lock separately, after the house was built, after the front lock was already in place. Someone who wanted this door to open only for a specific key. Carol Jean sat down on the hallway floor, her back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of her. The floor was cold through her jeans. The flashlight made a circle on the ceiling above the locked door. She took out her phone. 1 bar of signal, barely holding. She thought about the shoebox. Under the bed at the house on Mockingbird Lane, behind the extra blankets, where she had put it 8 months ago and not opened it since. She called Patsy Gilmore, who lived 2 doors down and had a key to the house for emergencies. Patsy, I need a favor. There's a shoebox under my bed. The left side, behind the extra blankets. Brown lid, no label. Can you look inside and tell me what's there? She heard Patsy put the phone down. Footsteps, a pause, the sound of cardboard. There's a little key, Patsy said. Real small, and a piece of paper. Looks like a name. Colin Marsh, attorney at law. 14 Sycamore Street, Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Carol Jean looked at the locked door. Can you overnight it to me, Patsy? She gave the Ridge Hollow address. Patsy didn't ask questions, which was one of the things Carol Jean had always appreciated about her. After she hung up, she stayed on the floor. The cedar smell was stronger here, close to the locked door, as if whatever was behind it had been breathing through the gap at the bottom for years. In her coat pocket, the silver thimble was colder than it had been that morning. Wait until you need it. She had not understood those words in March, standing in the room in Sevierville with the apple bread unopened on the nightstand. She had not understood them in the months that followed, when the marriage came apart quietly and the shoebox stayed where it was. She was beginning to understand them now. Carol Jean sat on the floor of Ida May's hallway, her back against the wall, and looked at the locked door and waited for morning. The sign above the door was wood, not brass. Hand-routed letters painted black, the paint going thin at the edges from years of weather. Colin Marsh, attorney at law. Below it, smaller. Established 1981. 14 Sycamore Street was a brick building 1 block off the main road in Gatlinburg, sandwiched between a watch repair shop and a place that sold homemade fudge to tourists. The fudge shop wasn't open yet. The watch repair was. Carol Jean could hear the small, precise sounds of it through the wall when she stepped into Marsh's waiting room. A woman at the front desk looked up. Before Carol Jean could give her name, a door opened at the back of the room and a man filled the frame. 71, maybe. White hair gone the color of good cotton. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was not tall, but he stood the way men stand when they have spent a long time being the person others call when things go wrong. He looked at Carol Jean for a moment. I wondered when you'd come, he said. His office held 2 chairs across from his desk, a filing cabinet older than Carol Jean, and a window that looked out at the side wall of the fudge shop. He poured coffee from a pot on the credenza without asking if she wanted any, and set a mug in front of her. He opened a folder. Ida Mae Mercer came to see me in September of 2014, he said. She drove herself. She was 93 years old, and she drove herself from Sevierville in a 1997 Buick LeSabre. He said it the way you say something that still impresses you years later. She sat in that chair and told me exactly what she wanted. No confusion, no hesitation. She knew her assets, she knew her wishes, and she knew who she wanted to receive them. He turned the folder toward Carol Jean. The will was 4 pages, notarized, witnessed by his paralegal and by the woman from the watch repair shop next door. Carol Jean read her own name in the 2nd paragraph and stopped. Carol Jean Mercer, wife of Douglas Allen Mercer, to receive in full the real property at 447 Ridge Hollow Road, Sevier County, Tennessee, including the structure and all contents therein. All contents therein. She said something to me when she signed it, Marsh said. I wrote it down because I thought I might need to remember it. He found a note card in the folder, handwritten. She said, I want the person who sat with me to have what I built, not the people who came to sign things. Carol Jean set the will down on the desk. Her hands were steady. She was not sure how. Shirley Mercer challenged it, she said. It was not a question. Filed in probate court, January 2020. Testamentary incapacity. Marsh's voice stayed even. The argument was that Ida Mae lacked the mental capacity to execute a valid will at 93. He took a sip of his coffee. We had her physician's records from September 2014. Full cognitive evaluation, conducted 2 weeks before she came to see me. Her mind was clear. The challenge was denied. November 2020. He paused. November 14th. Carol Jean did the math without meaning to. The divorce settlement had been signed in February. 3 months after the court had confirmed she was the legal owner of 447 Ridge Hollow Road. "Mrs. Shirley Mercer called my office twice after the ruling," Marsh said. He was looking at his coffee mug. "She wanted to know whether the probate decision was part of the public record." "And you told her?" "I told her it was, yes." The watch repair sounds came through the wall, small and regular. "I sent notification by certified mail," Marsh said, "to the address on file, 4412 Mockingbird Lane, Knoxville." He opened a second page in the folder. Return receipt was signed December 3rd. He slid the receipt across the desk. The signature was not Carol Jean's. She recognized Douglas's handwriting. The way he made his capital D, the small hook at the bottom. She had seen it on Christmas cards and birthday checks, and 3 months ago, on the dissolution agreement Dave Coulter had laid in front of them both. "Who managed the mail at that address?" Carol Jean asked. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't say," he said. He didn't need to. Carol Jean looked at the return receipt for a long time. Then she looked at the will. Then she looked at the window and the brick wall of the fudge shop beyond it. "The financial disclosure form," she said. "In the divorce, both parties are required to list all assets." "That's correct. The property at Ridge Hollow wasn't listed." "No," Marsh said. "It was not. Douglas signed that form." "He did." Marsh folded his hands on the desk. "A property that had been legally yours since November 14th was not disclosed in a December divorce proceeding. That's not an oversight, Mrs. Mercer. Under Tennessee law, that's fraudulent misrepresentation, potentially perjury, given that the disclosure was made under oath." The room was very quiet. "You have options," Marsh said, "when you're ready to discuss them." Carol Jean picked up the will and folded it once, carefully, along the original crease. She put it in her coat pocket. It settled against the silver thimble, 2 things Ida May had set in motion years apart, arriving in her pocket on the same morning. "Not yet," she said. "First, I want to see what's in that room." Marsh nodded, as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. He reached into his desk drawer and slid a small key across the desk. Brass, thin, with a round-barreled tip. "She left this with me," he said. "In 2014. She said you'd know what it opened." Carol Jean picked it up. It was lighter than the other key, lighter than it had any right to be, for something that had been waiting 10 years. She put it in her pocket with the will and the thimble and walked out into the November morning. The small key went in smooth, like it had been made for exactly this lock, which, she would learn later, it had. One turn. A single clean click. The door swung inward. The cedar smell hit her first, deeper than the rest of the house, concentrated, the way a drawer smells when it has held the same thing for decades. Carol Jean stood in the doorway and found the light switch by feel, low on the left side of the frame. A single bulb in the ceiling came on. Warm. Enough. She stepped inside. The room was maybe 12 feet by 14. No windows. 3 walls lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelving. The boards fitted tight and level. The uprights anchored into the wall studs with the kind of care that assumes the shelves will be carrying weight for a long time. Each shelf held objects wrapped in white muslin, tied with narrow strips of cotton ribbon. Each bundle had a small paper label, handwritten in ink that had faded to brown. Carol Jean counted the first shelf. 14 bundles. She counted the second. 16. She started the third and lost track and started again. She counted wrong the first time. She went back to the beginning and counted every shelf, every bundle, moving her lips the way she'd done in nursing school when the numbers had to be exact. 127. She stood in the middle of the room with that number and did not move for a while. Then she went to the nearest shelf and read the label on the first bundle. Home Before the Road, IMH 1947. She untied the ribbon. The muslin fell open in her hands. The quilt inside was larger than she expected, perhaps 4 feet square, the fabric still bright despite its age, the colors holding the particular clarity of work that has never been exposed to light. It showed a house on a hill, a small house, wood-framed, stone chimney, an apple tree to the left. The same house from the quilt in the bedroom, but fuller here. A garden along the south wall, a clothesline with 3 shirts on it, a dog lying on the porch with its chin on its paws, and in the far right corner of the image, worked in thread so fine it might have been pencil, a road. New, straight, a machine the size of Carol Jean's thumbnail pushing earth to one side. Ida May had stitched the thing that ended the house into the same image as the house itself. She had not looked away from it. Carol Jean set the quilt down carefully and reached for the next label. The Women at the Church Auction. Sevierville First Baptist. Fall 1962. IMH. 15 faces, stitched in brown and rust, and a deep particular red that Carol Jean could not name. Each face different. Each woman's hands doing something. Folding, carrying, pouring, counting bills into a cigar box. Not one of them looking out at the viewer. They were working, and they did not need to be watched to be real. She set it down and moved along the shelf. The third label stopped her. SM 1974. IMH. She untied the ribbon slowly. The quilt showed a woman standing at a door. Not just any door. Carol Jean recognized the transom window above it, the brass kickplate at the bottom. The front door of the Mercer house on Caldwell Street, where Shirley had lived since 1971, and where Douglas had grown up, and where Carol Jean had eaten Christmas dinner for 26 years. The woman in the quilt was young, late 20s. Dark hair, a child on her hip, a boy, small, maybe 2 years old. The woman's shoulders were back. Her chin was level. Her free hand gripped the door handle, and her mouth was turned up at the corners in what was technically a smile. But Ida May had stitched the eyes true. They were the eyes of someone who has decided, standing on a threshold, that she will not let them see her uncertain, that she will walk in as if she belongs and keep walking in that way until it becomes true. Carol Jean knew those eyes. She had worn them herself. The first Thanksgiving she had spent with the Mercer family, 28 years ago, standing at that same door with a pie she had made from scratch because she'd wanted to bring something they couldn't criticize. Ida May had seen Shirley. She had seen her since 1974. Carol Jean stood with the quilt in her hands for a long time. She was not sure what she felt exactly. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either of those. The particular stillness that comes when you understand that someone else saw the truth before you did, and wrote it down so it would still be there when you arrived. She set the quilt back in its muslin wrapping and tied the ribbon the way she'd found it. Then she took the silver thimble from her coat pocket. She held it for a moment. IMH, worn smooth at the tip, the silver gone soft with handling. Ida May Hargrove, before she was a Mercer. The name she'd been born with and had carried underneath the other one her whole life. Carol Jean walked to the last shelf, bottom row, far right corner, the only empty space in the room. She set the thimble there. It fit the space the way the key had fit the lock. She stepped back and looked at the room. 127 bundles on 3 walls and a silver thimble on the last empty shelf, and the cedar smell around everything like a kept promise. "I found it," she said. The room didn't answer. But it didn't need to. Outside, the November light was going. Carol Jean did not move to turn off the lamp. What was in this room didn't need more light. It had been waiting in the dark long enough. Bertie Mae Lawson had not been surprised to see a stranger at her door at 8 in the morning. She lived a mile down a dirt road in the Smokies. Strangers didn't come unless they needed something real. She opened the door, looked Carol Jean over once. The coat, the tired eyes, the way she was standing with her weight slightly forward, like someone who had not slept well on a hard surface, and turned back into the house. "Sit down," she said. "I'm making coffee." She didn't ask Carol Jean's name. She already knew it. Daryl at the hardware store in Ridgedale had called the evening before. The way people in small mountain communities have always called each other when something worth knowing happens up the road. Carol Jean sat at the kitchen table. Yellow curtains on the window above the sink. A braided rug in brown and green. On the wall beside the refrigerator, a quilting frame hung on 2 nails, a half-finished piece still stretched across it, the needle threaded and resting, waiting for the next morning's work. Bertie Mae set 2 mugs on the table and poured without asking how Carol Jean took it. She was 68, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that come from decades of physical work, thick at the knuckles, sure in their movements. She taught quilting on Thursday evenings at First Baptist, and had done so for 30 years. She sat down across from Carol Jean and wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at her directly. "You're the one who came every month," she said. "Yes, Ida Mae talked about you." She said it plainly, not as a compliment or a comfort, just as a fact that deserved to be stated. She didn't talk about many people. Bertie Mae had started learning from Ida Mae in 1978, when she was 22 and newly married, and living in the small house her husband's family had left him at the bottom of the ridge. She had knocked on Ida Mae's door because a woman at the church had said Ida Mae knew quilting, and Bertie Mae had wanted to learn. "She didn't teach like a teacher," Bertie Mae said. "She sat beside you and worked on her own piece while you worked on yours. When you made a mistake, she didn't say anything. She just reached over and took the seam ripper and fixed it herself. Then she handed it back." She looked at her coffee. "After a while, you stopped making the same mistakes because you didn't want her to have to fix them. 3 years of twice-weekly visits. And by the end of them, words between the 2 women had become largely optional." Carol Jean told her what she had found in the room. All of it. The shelves, the muslin bundles, the labels, the number. Bertie Mae listened without interrupting. When Carol Jean mentioned the quilt labeled SM 1974, Bertie Mae set her mug down. "She saw everything," Bertie Mae said quietly. "That woman saw everything, and she put it where it would keep." "Did you know about the room?" Carol Jean asked. "I knew there was one." Bertie Mae refilled both mugs without being asked. "In 2010, I asked her directly. I said, 'Ida Mae, what's in that room at the end of the hall?' She looked at me and said, 'When the time is right, the right person will come.'" She sat back down. I knew better than to ask again. Carol Jean thought about that. Ida Mae at 89, already certain, already waiting. "How did she live up there alone so long?" Carol Jean asked. "Until 94. She didn't do it alone." Bertie Mae said it the way you correct a misunderstanding that matters. "I brought supplies up every Thursday from about 2005 on. Groceries, medicine, whatever she needed. Earl Fenton from the church checked the electric and the water pump once a month. And you came every month from 2009. She looked at Carol Jean. "That's not alone. That's just not family." The distinction landed quietly in the room between them. In 2015, Bertie Mae said, when the family came to move her things to the care facility, Shirley Mercer came with the younger son. She said it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. She walked through the house and she looked at the quilts Ida May had in the front room, the ones she kept out, not the ones she'd put away, and she called them old rags. Said she'd arranged to have them donated or disposed of. Said nobody needed to be burdened with all that old fabric. Carol Jean was very still. Ida May was 94 years old, and she was using a walker, Bertie May said. She stood in the doorway of that front room and she said, "Nobody takes anything from my house while I'm still in it." She picked up her mug. Shirley said, "Fine, Ida May, nobody wants it anyway," and she smiled when she said it. Carol Jean recognized the smile. She had seen it across a conference table less than 24 hours ago. The following week, Bertie May continued, Ida May called me and asked if I knew a good locksmith in the county. I gave her a name. I didn't ask why. A pause. I figured she'd tell me if she wanted me to know. She set her mug down and looked at Carol Jean across the table. She made those quilts for people, she said. Her whole life, that's what she did. She just never got to choose which people. She was quiet for a moment. Until now, I guess. Outside the yellow curtains, the November morning had gone gray and still. Somewhere on the ridge above them, in a room that smelled of cedar and had held its contents in darkness for years, 127 bundles sat on their shelves, waiting to be seen. Carol Jean wrapped both hands around her mug the same way Bertie May had. She thought about Ida May at 94, walker in hand, standing in a doorway, not moving. Dr. Nina Rourke drove 2 hours from Knoxville and spent the first 10 minutes reading labels without going inside. Carol Jean stood in the hallway and watched her through the open door of the quilt room. Rourke moved along the nearest shelf slowly, bending close to each label, not touching the bundles, just reading. She had set her bag down in the hallway before entering. Laptop, camera, a manila folder that had seen considerable use. She wore cotton gloves she'd pulled on before crossing the threshold. When she finally turned around, her face was careful in the way faces are careful when they are working to stay professional. "How many?" she asked. 127, Carol Jean said, plus 3 larger bundles at the end. Rourke looked back at the shelves. Then she opened the manila folder and removed a photocopied document, several pages, dense with text and small black and white photographs. She held it up beside the nearest label and looked between them. "I've been looking for this collection for 11 years, she said. "I want you to know that before we go any further, so you understand where I'm standing right now." Bertie May arrived at 11, without being called. She appeared in the doorway in her barn coat with a thermos of coffee and took the chair Carol Jean brought from the kitchen without comment. She sat at the threshold of the room and watched Rourke work the way you watch someone do something you have strong opinions about but have decided not to voice. Rourke worked methodically. She photographed each bundle before opening it, recorded the label information, then unfolded the muslin and examined the quilt inside with a loop she wore on a cord around her neck. She made notes in a small book with a soft cover, writing in the compressed hand of someone accustomed to fitting a great deal onto a small page. She did not rush. Carol Jean watched her open the bundle labeled Home Before the Road, IMH 1947, and hold it to the window light. Rourke was quiet for nearly a minute. "This is the first piece in the Smithsonian catalog," she said. She held up the photocopied document. One page showed a small, poorly reproduced photograph. A photograph of a photograph, Carol Jean realized. The image gone soft through 2 generations of copying. They cataloged it in 1989 from a single reference image. No dimensions, no provenance beyond the maker's name. Current location listed as unknown. She looked at the quilt in her hands. The original researcher noted the machine in the corner, the road being built. "She stitched the ending into the beginning," Bertie May said from the doorway. Rourke looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." She set the quilt down and kept moving. At the far end of the bottom shelf, 3 bundles sat apart from the others. Larger, the muslin thicker, the ribbon doubled. Rourke reached them in the early afternoon and stopped. She read the label on the first one without untying it. Then she looked at Carol Jean. "Has anyone opened these?" "Not yet." Rourke untied the ribbon carefully and folded back the muslin. The fabric inside was not a quilt, not in the traditional sense. No geometric pattern, no repeated block, no border. It was a large piece of natural linen, perhaps 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, covered from edge to edge in stitched images and text. Scenes arranged in sequence, figures rendered in thread with the precision of someone who had spent decades making her hands do exactly what her eyes intended. And beneath each scene, worked in thread so small Carol Jean had to lean in to read it. Words, dates, names. A running record in the only medium Ida May had trusted completely. "A narrative textile," Rourke said. Her voice had gone quiet. "I've seen 2 others in my career. One is in the Smithsonian collection. The other is at the American Folk Art Museum in New York." She looked up. She didn't keep a diary. She stitched one. Bertie May made a sound from the doorway. Not a word. Just a sound. Carol Jean stood very still. "Wait until you need it." She had heard those words in March of the previous year, in a room in Sevierville with apple bread on the nightstand. She had heard them again, silently, outside the locked door in this hallway. And now, standing in front of 3 panels of stitched linen that held everything Ida May had ever witnessed and chosen to record, she understood them for the first time completely. Ida May had not been waiting for the right moment. She had been waiting for the right person to be ready. By late afternoon, Rourke had examined every bundle. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her laptop, and Carol Jean sat across from her. Bertie May had made more coffee and taken her chair by the window. "I'll need time to complete comparable sales research," Rourke said, "but I can give you a preliminary range." Carol Jean nodded. "The standalone quilts, based on current market for authenticated work by documented Appalachian artists at this level. Low end, 800,000 for the collection. High end, closer to 1.4 million. She paused. "Those numbers assume the collection stays together. Scattered, each piece is worth considerably less. The narrative panels I can't price. The Smithsonian will have opinions about that." The kitchen was quiet. "The right institutional buyer," Rourke continued, "will want to keep this intact. University collections, folk art foundations, preservation trusts. I can make introductions when you're ready." Carol Jean looked at the table, the same table she now understood, that Ida May had sat at for 30 years. The same chairs, the same window looking out at the same ridge. Rourke closed her notebook and looked up. "There are 3 diary panels," she said. "Have you read them?" Carol Jean shook her head. "Then that's what tonight is for." She spread the 3 diary panels on the living room floor and sat in the middle of them, the way she used to sit in the middle of the hospital break room at 2 in the morning, when the ward was quiet and she had 20 minutes that belonged to nobody. The lamp from the bedroom cast enough light. Outside, the November wind moved through the ridge trees, pressing against the walls in long, slow intervals. The walls held. The 3rd panel started after Thomas died. Carol Jean looked at it before she looked at the others and thought, Ida May lived alone on this mountain for 30 years after he was gone. What did she stitch when there was no one left to stitch for? She started at the beginning. The first panel covered the years before Thomas and the early years after. Ida May Hargrove growing up in Ridge Hollow, youngest of 3 daughters in a house with a stone chimney and an apple tree, The same house in the quilt on the bedroom wall, she realized. The same house in Home Before the Road. Her mother hanging laundry. Her father splitting wood with a maul he held two-handed. A school building with 6 windows. A church with 1. Then Thomas Mercer, appearing, then staying, the way some people do. The mother-in-law, Eleanor, filled several panels. A stout woman with her hair pinned back, hands always occupied. Carol Jean read the stitched text beneath one scene. She showed me how to put up tomatoes the 1st September. She didn't ask. She just handed me a jar and started talking. And near the end of the first panel, Eleanor, older, slower, in a chair by a window. She softened at the end. Some do. Not bitterness. Not absolution. Just the plain record of what had been true. Carol Jean sat with that for a moment. Then she moved to the second panel. The second panel was harder. Shirley Anderson arrived in the first scene as a young woman in a church dress, standing beside Harold Jr., who was tall and uncertain-looking, in a way his son Douglas would inherit. The early stitched notes were observational. She watches before she moves. She learns by looking, not by asking. Carol Jean read that twice. Then the years turned. The kitchen reorganized. The family calendar moved from the wall beside the telephone to a drawer. Decisions about holidays, about visits, about who came and when and for how long, consolidated quietly into one pair of hands. Harold Jr. in the later panels appeared less frequently, and when he did appear, he was always slightly to one side, present but peripheral, the way furniture is present in a room. And Thomas. Thomas, who had built this house with those hands, who had cleared this land and laid these floors and fitted these walls. Thomas appeared in the second panel's later pages in a single repeated image, sitting on the back steps of the house in Knoxville, looking out at something beyond the frame. Carol Jean found the stitched line beneath it. He stopped arguing in 1979. I understood why. I did the same. 8 words. She sat with those 8 words for a long time, 50 years of a woman's life, and she had found the truest thing about it in 8 stitched words on a piece of linen on a floor in the Smoky Mountains. Ida May had chosen silence the same way Carol Jean had chosen silence. Not from weakness, not from not knowing, but from the particular calculus that women learn when they understand that some arguments cost more than they return. She had known. She had done the same, and she had written it down so that someone, someday, would know she had known. 8 words. That was all. That was everything. The third panel was different in the way a season is different when it finally turns. The colors brightened. Not dramatically. Ida May was not a dramatic woman. But the palette opened up, the backgrounds lighter, the scenes given more space to breathe. Thomas was gone from these pages, but his absence did not fill them. Other things did. Bertie May appeared early in the third panel and stayed, sitting across from Ida May at this table, standing at a quilting frame. And once, in a small scene near the bottom of the second page, with her arms around Ida May's shoulders, both women's faces turned away from the viewer, toward something outside the frame that Carol Jean could not see, but understood. The panel moved through the years, seasons on the mountain, the garden, the ridge at different hours of light. And then, 12 pages in, a new figure. A woman in a car, an apple tree beside a road sign, a table with 2 chairs, a window, a mug. Beneath it, in threads so small Carol Jean had to bring the lamp down to the floor to read it. CJM, apple bread, the window. 5 words. Carol Jean set the lamp down and sat back. Ida May had stitched her into the record. Not with a full scene, not with a name spelled out, not with any explanation of who she was, or why she mattered. Just 5 words and a figure at a table by a window, returning, month after month, in the only way Carol Jean had known how to show up. She stayed on the floor for a while after that, not reading, just sitting. When she went back to the quilt room, she found what she had missed the first night. Bottom shelf, far right, beside the space where she had placed the thimble. A bundle slightly smaller than the others, the muslin folded differently, not wrapped but tucked, the way you tuck something you expect to need again soon. The label read, Unfinished, IMH 2017. Inside, a quilting frame, collapsed for storage, and stretched across it, pinned in place, a quilt half made. The completed half showed this house, this hallway, the dark wood door at the end of it. The colors were exactly right. She recognized the cedar brown, the gray of the stone fireplace, the particular quality of light through these windows in the late afternoon. The other half was white, empty, waiting. Ida May had started it in 2017, 2 years before she died, when her hands had already begun to slow. She had gotten halfway and stopped, not because she had lost interest, and not because she had forgotten what came next. She had run out of time, not thread. Carol Jean lifted the frame carefully and carried it to the kitchen table. She set it under the lamp where the light was best. She looked at the white half for a long time. I have thread, she thought. I have time. I just need to learn. The Escalade came up the dirt road on a Wednesday, which Carol Jean had expected. People like Shirley Mercer didn't let things sit. They always came back. Carol Jean was on the porch with Bertie May when she heard the engine, too large for the road, moving too fast for the surface. She recognized the sound before the vehicle appeared around the last bend. Bertie May set her coffee mug down on the porch rail, slowly, without comment. The Escalade parked at the edge of the clearing. Shirley got out first. Navy coat, pressed slacks, low heels impractical for a dirt road in November. Her hair was done. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, as if appearance were a form of argument. Wayne followed from the driver's side. Polo shirt, athletic shoes, phone already in his hand. He looked at the house, then at Carol Jean on the porch, then back at his phone. They crossed the clearing. Carol Jean did not stand up. Nadia, Shirley said, and then stopped, catching herself. Carol Jean. The slip was small. Carol Jean filed it away. Shirley, she said. Wayne. We heard you found some of Ida May's things, Shirley said. She stopped at the base of the porch steps. She did not ask to come up. That's right. The family would like to take a look. Carol Jean set her own mug down. You're welcome to look, but this is my property. I'd like Colin Marsh present if there's anything to discuss. Wayne looked up from his phone for the first time. Shirley's expression did not change. We're not here to discuss anything. We just want to see what's there. Then come in, Carol Jean said. She held the front door open. Bertie May remained on the porch, settled in her chair, her hands around her mug. The door to the quilt room was open at the end of the hall, and Shirley's eyes went straight to it, the way eyes go to the one open door in a long hallway. Shirley walked through the front room without looking at it, past the fireplace, past the kitchen doorway, down the hall. Wayne followed but stopped at the threshold of the quilt room. He leaned against the doorframe and looked in but did not enter. Carol Jean stood in the hallway. Shirley moved along the shelves the way she moved through every room she entered, assessing, pricing, categorizing by usefulness. Her eyes traveled across the muslin bundles and their handwritten labels without visible reaction. She was working to keep her face professional, and she was largely succeeding. until she reached the wall opposite the door. Carol Jean had hung 3 quilts there. Not all of them, just 3. Home before the road. The church auction women, 15 faces bent over their work. And SM 1974 at eye level in the center. Shirley stopped. The young woman in the quilt looked back at her. Dark hair, a child on her hip, hand on the door handle of the house on Caldwell Street. Mouth turned up, eyes doing something else entirely. The room was very quiet. She had no right, Shirley said. Her voice was controlled and even, and gave very little away. She had every right, Carol Jean said. This was her house. This was her work. And this was the truth she saw. That's a piece of fabric. That's your family's history. You're the only person in this room who doesn't want to look at it. Shirley's jaw moved slightly. Then she turned from the quilt and looked at the shelves. 124 bundles still in their muslin, still tied with their ribbon, labels outward. These items are Mercer family property, she said. Whatever Ida may have intended, the provenance of these objects, the will is filed in Sevier County Probate Court, Carol Jean said. The challenge was denied November 14th. Colin Marsh has the certified mail receipt with your son's signature, dated December 3rd. Shirley said nothing. The disclosure form Douglas signed listed no property at this address, Carol Jean continued. Marsh has filed a motion to set aside the settlement. I expect you've heard from your attorney about that already. Wayne pushed off the doorframe. We should go, Shirley. His voice was flat. Not angry, not sorry. The voice of a man who has decided something and is past discussing it. Wayne, Shirley turned slightly. I talked to Gordon last month, he said. Gordon was the family's attorney in Knoxville. He told me the same thing she just told you. I've known since October. He looked once more around the room, at the shelves, at the 3 hanging quilts, at the silver thimble on the bottom shelf in the corner. Then he looked at Carol Jean with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not apology, not hostility, something closer to relief. He walked back down the hall and out the front door. His footsteps crossed the porch. The escalade door opened and closed. Shirley did not move. She was looking at the quilt again. The young woman at the door of the house on Caldwell Street. The child on her hip. The hand gripping the handle. Carol Jean waited. She shouldn't have done this, Shirley said. Quieter now. The control still there but thinner, the way ice is thin in early spring when it still looks solid from a distance. She didn't agree with you about that, Carol Jean said. Shirley stood with the quilt for another moment. Her free hand moved to the strap of her handbag, adjusted it, the way you adjust something that doesn't need adjusting. The young woman in the quilt was still holding the door handle, still deciding whether she belonged. Shirley picked up her handbag and walked to the doorway. She paused there, her back still to Carol Jean. She did not turn around. Her footsteps went down the hall, across the front room, out the door. The porch boards took her weight and released it. The escalade started. The tires moved slow across the gravel, and then faster on the dirt road, and then the sound diminished and was gone. Carol Jean stood alone in the quilt room. She looked at the young woman in SM 1974, the hand on the door handle, the eyes that knew what they were doing even when the mouth pretended otherwise. She knew that look. She had put it away a long time ago. Ida May had kept it. Bertie May appeared in the hallway a few minutes later, moving quietly in her barn coat, thermos in hand. They came, she said. They came. Wayne left first. Yes. Bertie May looked past Carol Jean at the 3 quilts on the wall. She looked at SM 1974 for a moment, without speaking. Did she look at it? Bertie May asked. She looked at it. Good. Bertie May poured coffee into Carol Jean's mug, which had gone cold on the shelf where she'd set it down. Ida May would have wanted her to look at it. She set the thermos on the shelf and took the chair Carol Jean brought from the kitchen and sat at the threshold of the room, the same way she'd sat when Rourke was working, at the edge of things, steady. The gravel had long since settled. The road outside was quiet. Carol Jean stood in the doorway of the quilt room and looked at the wall where Shirley's young face stared out from 1974, still standing at a threshold, still working out whether she would be let in. The room felt lighter than it had an hour ago. She wasn't sure that was the right word for it, but it was the closest one she had. The car that came up the road on Saturday was not the Escalade. It was a blue Camry with a dent in the rear bumper, a dent Carol Jean had put there in 2018, backing into the mailbox on Mockingbird Lane. She had offered to have it fixed. Douglas had said, "Don't worry about it." The dent had stayed, and then the marriage had not. And here was the dent coming up her dirt road on a November morning. Douglas sat in the car for 5 minutes before he got out. Carol Jean watched from the kitchen window. She did not go to the door. He was wearing a gray pullover and jeans and the hiking shoes he'd bought 3 years ago and never hiked in. No jacket despite the cold. He stood beside the car and looked at the house for a moment, then looked at the ridge above it, then looked at the ground. He knocked once. Stopped. Knocked again. Carol Jean opened the door. He looked older than he had at the lawyer's office, which had been less than 2 weeks ago. Something in his face had shifted in the way faces shift when a person has spent time alone with something they would rather not have had to think about. "I'm not here about the house, so," he said, first thing before she could speak. "I just want to see what she left." Carol Jean looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside. She led him down the hall to the quilt room door and stopped there. She did not go in. Douglas stepped inside alone. He moved the way men move in spaces that make them uncertain. Slowly, hands at his sides, not touching anything. He read the labels on the nearest shelf, bending slightly to see the handwriting. He moved to the next shelf and read those too. He stopped at Home Before the Road, IMH 1947. He stood there long enough that Carol Jean, watching from the hallway, counted her own breaths. Then he moved to the hanging quilts, the churchwomen, and then SM 1974. His mother, young, at the door of the house he'd grown up in, the child on her hip, his own older brother Harold, 2 years old and unaware he was being recorded. Douglas looked at it without expression. He moved to the narrative panels, unrolled now, and pinned to a length of cord Rourke had strung along the far wall for examination. He started at the beginning of the second panel, the Shirley years, and read slowly, scene by scene, the way you read something you are not sure you want to finish. He found the Thomas entry, the back steps, the ridge. He stopped arguing in 1979. I understood why. I did the same. He read it twice. Carol Jean could tell by the way his head moved. Then he found the third panel. He walked its length and stopped near the end, at the small scene 12 pages in. A woman in a car, an apple tree, a table, a window, a mug, and beneath it, CJM, apple bread. The window. His hand came up. He reached toward the panel and stopped, his fingers an inch from the fabric. He held them there for a moment, not touching, just near. Then he let his hand drop. He stood with his back to Carol Jean for a while. When he turned around, he did not look at her. He looked at the room itself, the shelves, the bundles, the thimble on the bottom shelf in the corner. I signed for the letter, he said. From Marsh, December 3rd. His voice was even. He was not making excuses. He was stating facts, the way you state facts when you have decided that honesty is the only thing left available to you. I gave it to my mother. She said she'd handle it. Carol Jean said nothing. I signed the disclosure form for the divorce, he said. Ridge Hollow wasn't on it. A pause. I knew the letter existed. I knew what it was about. He looked at the floor. I didn't ask her what she was going to do with it. The room held that. Then Douglas walked to the far wall, where the third diary panel hung, and he stood in front of it. Not the CJM section, but the earlier pages, the ones that covered his grandmother's years alone on the mountain. He looked at the stitched images of the ridge in different seasons, the garden, the kitchen table, the quilting frame by the window. He looked at all of it. And then he sat down on the floor, not dramatically, not with any particular intention that Carol Jean could read. His back went to the shelving, and he slid down it and sat with his knees up and his hands loose in his lap, the way a person sits when their legs have simply decided they are done. He looked up at the ceiling. I didn't come up here, he said. When she was alive, not enough. He was not speaking to Carol Jean. He was speaking to the room, or to the panels on the wall, or to the woman who had stitched them. My mother said she was fine. I let myself believe that because it was easier than coming. He was quiet for a moment. She made all of this, alone, on this mountain, and not one person in my family knew. Another silence. I'm sorry, Ida May. He said it to the ceiling, to the cedar smell and the lamplight, and the 127 bundles on the shelves around him. The room did not answer. Carol Jean stood in the doorway and did not go in. This was not her moment to enter. She understood that the way she understood most things, not by being told, but by reading what was in front of her. After 5 minutes, Douglas stood up. He came to the doorway and looked at Carol Jean directly for the first time since he'd arrived. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, he said. No, Carol Jean said. One word. Not hard. Not soft. Just true. He nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected and perhaps the one he deserved. What will you do with them? He asked. He looked back at the room, at the shelves, at the panels, at the thimble on the corner shelf. Keep them here, Carol Jean said. Where they belong. He nodded again. He put on his jacket, which he'd been carrying over one arm the entire time. He walked back down the hall, across the front room, out the door. His footsteps crossed the porch. The Camry door opened and closed. The engine turned over. That particular sound, familiar from 29 years of hearing it in driveways and parking lots, and the garage on Mockingbird Lane at hours when she'd stopped asking where he'd been. The tires moved slowly across the gravel and onto the dirt road and around the last bend and were gone. Carol Jean stood in the doorway of the quilt room. The room was quiet and smelled of cedar and the November cold coming in from the hallway and something else she didn't have a word for. Something that had been in the room long before she arrived and would remain after she left and had nothing to do with her at all, except that she was the one Ida May had sent the key to. She had things to do. She went back inside. By May, the mountain had turned green and the house had turned into something Carol Jean didn't have a word for yet. Not a home exactly. Not yet. Something in progress. The porch was new. Frank Delgado from Sevierville had come up 3 weekends in March and April with lumber in his truck bed and replaced every board, sistered the corner posts, and sanded the railing smooth. He'd charged her for materials and refused to discuss labor. When she'd pushed, He'd said Bertie May had asked him to come up, and that was payment enough, and that had been the end of it. Carol Jean had stained the new boards herself. 3 coats, a natural finish that let the grain come through the way Ida May had let everything in this house come through without covering it. She had left one thing alone. On the underside of the bottom rail, near the left post, someone had carved 2 letters long ago. TM. She had stained around them. She had stained around it. Inside, the house had reorganized itself gradually, the way spaces do when someone begins to actually live in them rather than just occupy them. The kitchen table was where it had always been, but there was food in the cabinets now, and a coffee maker on the counter, and a hook by the door where Carol Jean hung her coat each evening when she came in from the porch. The bedroom had a proper mattress, bought second-hand from a woman in Gatlinburg whose number Bertie May had given her. The cast-iron skillet was in use again, handle still turned toward the wall the way Ida May had kept it. The quilt room was unchanged. Carol Jean had made no alterations to the shelves or the arrangement of the bundles. The only difference was the 3 panels hung on the cord along the far wall, visible now when you stood in the doorway, and the silver thimble on the bottom shelf in the corner, and the unfinished quilt on its frame on the kitchen table where the light was best. She had not yet touched it. She was not ready, but she looked at it every morning while she drank her coffee, the white half waiting beside the finished half, the ridge and the hallway, and the dark door stitched in Ida May's thread on one side and nothing on the other. The legal matter moved at the pace legal matters move. Marsh had filed the motion in February. The Mercer family attorney in Knoxville had responded in March. There had been correspondence Carol Jean did not fully understand, and a preliminary hearing she had not attended, and a continuance she had not requested. Marsh called every few weeks with updates she wrote in a notebook she kept beside the coffee maker. He had told her in April that the case was solid. He had told her in May that solid cases still took time. She had thanked him and asked if there was anything she needed to do, and he had said not yet, and she had said all right. She did not count the days. She had started working 3 days a week at Saviourville Medical Center in March. Light duty, desk-based, patient check-ins and medication reviews. The kind of nursing work that didn't require her to be on her feet for 12 hours. Her back had improved in the months since the divorce, steadily and without drama, the way physical things sometimes improve when the source of tension is removed. The work paid enough. Rourke had told her in April the university partnership would happen. Carol Jean had decided to believe her. The first Saturday class happened in early May. Bertie May brought 5 women from First Baptist up the dirt road in her truck, 2 in the cab and 3 in the bed with their quilting bags on their laps. They ranged in age from 53 to 71. One of them, a woman named Glenna, had been quilting for 40 years and was really there to see the collection. The other 4 were genuine beginners. Carol Jean set up chairs in the living room and borrowed 2 card tables from the hardware store in Ridgedale. Bertie May taught. Carol Jean sat among the students with a beginner's frame and a fat needle and thread she kept knotting. She was not good at it. Her first stitch went in at the wrong angle and puckered the fabric, and Bertie May came over without comment, took the needle and fixed it, then handed it back. Carol Jean recognized the method. Glenna, sitting beside the window with her own work, looked up at SM 1974 on the wall and asked about it. Bertie May set down what she was doing. Ida May didn't stitch sin, she said. She stitched truth. Those aren't the same thing. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone's needle went back into their fabric, and someone else's followed, and the quiet became the particular productive quiet of people working with their hands on something that requires attention. Carol Jean wrote the sentence in the small notebook she had started keeping. She wasn't sure yet what the notebook was for. She wrote in it anyway. One evening in late May, she drove Bertie May home instead of letting her walk. as she had taken to doing on days when the weather was uncertain or when Bertie May had been on her feet longer than usual. Bertie May did not protest, which told Carol Jean something. At the house, Bertie May moved from the car to the porch steps with one hand on the door of the Camry and then one hand on the porch rail. Slow, deliberate, the grip a little tighter than it needed to be. Carol Jean sat in the car and watched. "Don't fuss," Bertie May said, not looking back. "You left the burner on last Tuesday," Carol Jean said. "It was on low." "Low is still on." Bertie May turned at the top step and looked at her. "I'm 70 years old on a mountain, Carol Jean. Not 90. "I know," Carol Jean said. They looked at each other in the early evening light. "Before you came up here," Bertie May said, "nobody checked on me regular. My daughter calls it Christmas. My son sends a card." She held the porch rail. "You're the one who shows up." Carol Jean didn't answer right away. "You showed up for Ida May," she said finally. "Every week, 15 years. Bertie May was quiet for a moment. "That's different," she said. "I don't think it is," Carol Jean said. Bertie May looked at her for another moment. Then she went inside. The screen door closed behind her, the spring taking it slow and easy. Carol Jean sat in the car until the kitchen light came on. Then she drove the 1.5 miles back up the road, to the house that was still becoming what it was always supposed to be. October came in quietly, the way good things sometimes do after a long time of noise. The ridge had turned overnight, not gradually the way spring comes, but all at once, the way the Smokies turn in October when the first cold night arrives and the trees decide together. Carol Jean had gone to bed with green outside her window and woken to red and gold, the particular red of Tennessee hickory that doesn't look the same anywhere else on earth. She made coffee before 5 and took it to the porch. The mountain was still in the early dark, the way mountains are still before the birds begin. The new porch boards held her weight without sound. The railing was smooth under her hand, the stain she'd put on in April worn slightly at the place where she rested her palm each morning, a mark of use that was also a mark of time. She had been here 9 months. She did not think of it that way exactly. She thought of it as the time since February, the time since the conference room and the key and the 3-hour drive west. But 9 months was what it was, and the mountain had all from winter to spring to summer to this, and she had gone from sleeping on a borrowed air mattress to sleeping in a bed with a quilt across it, one of Ida May's smaller pieces that Rourke had cleared for use, and the difference between those two versions of the same woman felt large enough to need a longer word than change. The thimble was on the kitchen table when she came inside. She had taken it from her coat pocket the night before for the first time since March of the previous year, set it on the table while she was looking for her keys, and then left it there, and then sat with her coffee and looked at it, and understood that she was not going to put it back. 19 months in her pocket. Through the divorce proceedings and the drive to Ridge Hollow, and the locked door, and the quilt room, and Bertie May's kitchen, and Marcia's office, and Shirley in the hallway, and Douglas on the floor, and all of it, every day of it, the small cold weight of IMH against her fingers when she needed to remember something. She picked it up now and carried it to the quilt room. The room was the same as it had always been. The shelves, the bundles in their muslin, the 3 panels on the cord, the cedar smell that had not diminished in 9 months of the door being open, the silver thimble on the bottom shelf in the corner, where she had placed it the first evening, had left a small ring in the shelf's dust, a circle the size of a coin. She set it back in the circle. IMH, Ida May Hargrove. The name before the other name. The name that had always been underneath. She stood there for a moment. Then she left it, and did not take it with her. Bertie May arrived at 8, as she did every Saturday. She came in without knocking. She had stopped knocking in July, and Carol Jean had stopped expecting her to, and set her quilting bag on the kitchen chair, and put the kettle on, and moved through the kitchen with the ease of a person in a space that has become familiar. She was slower than she'd been in the spring. Carol Jean noticed it the way she noticed everything now, the way she had noticed changes in patience for 19 years. Not the dramatic changes that announce themselves, but the small ones, the incremental ones, the ones that told you something true about the direction things were moving. The kettle came to a boil. Bertie May poured 2 cups. She carried them to the quilt room doorway and looked in. The unfinished quilt was on its frame, where it had been since November. The completed half, the house, the hallway, the dark door at the end, faced the room. The white half faced the wall. Bertie May stood at the threshold and looked at it. Then she set Carol Jean's cup on the hallway shelf and carried her own cup into the room and placed it on the corner shelf beside the thimble. She pulled the wooden chair from the wall, the same chair she'd sat in when Rourke was working, the same chair she'd used for every class since May, and set it in front of the frame. She sat down. She reached into her quilting bag and took out a small tin. Inside, arranged by color, were threads. The particular brown of the ridge tree bark in winter, the gray-white of chimney smoke, the cedar brown of these walls. Colors Carol Jean had not been able to name, but that Bertie May had known by sight, because she had sat in rooms with Ida May for 3 years and learned to see the way Ida May saw. She had prepared for this. She had brought exactly what was needed. She did not ask Carol Jean's permission. She did not say anything at all. She threaded the needle, slowly, her eyes close to the work, the thread catching the lamplight, and she found her place at the edge of the finished half, where Ida May's last stitch had ended in 2017, when her hands had finally refused what her mind was still asking of them. The needle went into the fabric. It came back out. Carol Jean stood in the doorway with her coffee. She did not go in. She watched Bertie May's hands, the knuckles thick, the movements deliberate, the rhythm unhurried, and she listened to the sound the needle made, small and regular, the way the watch repair sounds had come through the wall of Marcia's office in Gatlinburg on the morning that changed everything. It was the smallest sound in the world. It was enough. The October light came through the window above the kitchen sink and moved across the floor, the way light moves in old houses, finding the grain in the boards, making the wood alive. Outside, a wind came down from the ridge and moved through the trees, the hickory and the oak and the sourwood, the same trees that had stood here when Ida May built this life, and when Thomas was alive, and when the county road had not yet reached this far up the mountain. The trees held, the way they had always held. The house held, the way it had always held. And in the small room at the end of the hall, a needle went in and came back out, and in and came back out, and the work that wasn't finished was being finished, one careful stitch at a time. If someone showed up for you every month when no one else did, or if you've ever been handed something that turned out to be more than it looked, tell us in the comments. We read everyone.